Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And thank you again for returning after a fine lunch. The Catalan food is just superb. It's wonderful to be here. Can I encourage you during the remainder of the Safety Summit to take an opportunity to walk through the building, the palace, and admire the paintings and the architecture and the way in which it's decorated. This is truly a unique conference and one that we should take as an opportunity to appreciate the Spanish culture. My name is Ewan Ferguson. I'm a board member of the International Association of Wildland Fire. I'm co-chair of the organising committee, and again I'd like to acknowledge all of my colleagues from the International Association of Wildland Fire, but in particular Oriel and his team from Pau Costa, who have just done a marvellous job in transforming this palace into a conference venue, and it's been a wonderful experience, and hopefully this afternoon we'll continue to meet those very high standards. There has been a question asked about the videotaping, the cameras in the back of the sessions. We will endeavour to have the videos downloaded and a link on the International Association of Wildland Fire website, but this may not be achievable for another 10 days because Michael has got other duties she's attending to. So it's a good reason to consider joining as a member of the International Association of Wildland Fire. But if you keep your eye on that website, we'll make sure that the video and the audio is downloaded so that you can refer to it at a later time. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our second keynote speaker for this 14th Wildland Fire Safety Summit, Dr. Richard Thornton. Dr. Richard Thornton is the Chief Executive Officer of the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre in Australia. And it's a position he's held since the start of the CRC in 2013. Prior to that, Richard was a Deputy Chief Executive Officer and Research Director for the Bushfire CRC, a role he held since 2004. His responsibilities included leadership and oversight of the research program. Richard is a highly experienced and respected research management executive with over 20 years in the field, both with the Bushfire CRC and Telstra. Richard has a physics background and has worked in the science fields including nuclear and semiconductor physics, computational fluid mechanics, IT and telecommunications engineering and online service. We, in a very respectful way, call Richard our resident rocket scientist. In January 2016, Richard was also a member of the board of the International Association of Wildland Fire and the chair of the editorial advisory committee of the International Journal of Wildland Fire. Richard is also a current board member of the Cooperative Research Centre Association. And Richard today will be talking about fire survival systems and looking into the future. Please welcome with me Dr. Richard Thornton.
I'll start by falling over the step on the way up. I think I've got some slides. That one. Thank you. Okay, thank you all for your concentration after lunch, and I know it's always the hard session to bring yourself back after such a wonderful lunch. I'd like to start off just by thanking the organising committee for asking me to become a keynote speaker at this event, because I think safety is something that we all need to be aware of, and I'll try and outline some of the challenges I think that we all face. I will say I'm not a firefighter, I'm a researcher. And so I'm not going to approach this from an operational perspective, but hopefully I will leave you with a bunch of questions that you will take away that will help you in your thought processes as you go through the rest of today and over the next few months. No chief executive would be complete if you didn't say a few things about why and where I come from, so I'm going to keep that to a minimum, but just give you a bit of background about what my organisation does. I'm going to talk a bit about what is a fire survival system, because it was the first question I asked when Ewan and Alan Goodwin suggested I speak on this topic, which is not a topic I've spoken on before. So the first question I had was, well, what is it? I want to talk about some of the objectives and how we might be able to do things differently, and leave you with a few questions at the end. Briefly, the Bushfire Natural Hazards Research Centre is, as it says, a research centre. We have total funds from our country's government of about 130 million when we combine it with our states and territories. That's spread out over 8 years. So at the moment we're about halfway through that funding period. We have roughly, it depends on how you count them, 200 researchers across Australia and New Zealand, working on roughly 38 projects related to a whole load of factors across all hazards, not just fire. We fund 79 PhD students. We have roughly 50 partners. That's always rough because some of them incorporate whole of state as opposed to individual fire services. Of those 50, over half are end user organisations. And in the last financial year, we've done all the things that research organisations do, publish journal papers, etc. Just in terms of our scope, we obviously work on fire because it's in our name. Bushfire is one of those words that gets used in Australia and New Zealand. There's no uniform spelling. Sometimes it's with a space and sometimes without. But importantly, we've had our scope broadened into some of the other hazards that affect Australia, particularly flood, cyclones, storms, earthquake and tsunamis, and more recently heat wave. Heat wave in Australia and across the world probably kills more people than any other hazard. Certainly in Australia, it's over twice the number of people are killed by heat wave than by any other hazard. We have a bunch of things we don't do, so we don't do health and pandemic, we don't do animal disease, CBR stuff we don't do, and we don't look at terrorism. So the first question that came to my mind when I started looking at this is, we talk about a fire survival system. So a bunch of questions went through my mind about, what is it? Does it actually exist? If it is a system, who owns it? Who's involved in it? How is it interconnected? What's it made of? What are its core components? What are its weaknesses? How adaptive is it? What assumptions is that system based upon? And I'll come to some of those in a bit because it comes to objectives. How's it measured? How do we know what it's doing? What are its objectives? Does it even work? Are we in a safer environment today than we were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? Who's doing the surviving in the survival system? And that's important when we look at, say, some of the talks that we've seen across this conference so far, and I'm sure for the rest of the day, because there's almost a straight line that's drawn between firefighter survival and community survival. And I think when we start to look at some of our fire services, and certainly in Australia, a lot of our firefighters are volunteer firefighters, and they are members of the community. So it's all about the interconnectedness of community and the firefighters themselves. So there's some questions that I had in my mind. I think it's really important that in Mark's keynote this morning that we started talking about the need to think strategically. And what I want to do is to start at that strategic level and work our way down to individual systems that exist on the fire line. So if we take a step back and say, well, what's a system? You can look it up, and I used all the traditional things. So Wikipedia says it's a set of interacting and interdependent components, making a complex whole. Or it's a set of principles and procedures according to which something is done. So that wasn't much help when I went through that, when I said, well, if we're talking about a fire survival system, what does that really mean? So I went to something that I know quite well, which is the ISO 31000 risk management framework. Because what we're trying to manage here is something which is impacting on our objectives. And I'll come to that objectives comment again, because it's really important, because risk is something that impacts on our objectives. So in looking at this, we usually have this framework. The bit that everybody concentrates on is the bit on your right-hand side, is that little process about risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation, and treatment, going round and round that bit. But there's an important box in there, which is about establishing the context, which tends to largely be given short treatment, if you like, and we need to really look at what that means. And that's linked into this whole process of what is the mandate and commitment into risk management. Where does that come from? Who owns it, and is it uniform across organisations? So as a firefighter on a fire line, does he or she understand the commitment that the organisation has made to their safety? Do they understand the mandate that has been given to their line managers up through the establishment to interact and to have a safe working environment? And that comes back to what I think is probably the most important bit of the ISO framework, which is this whole bit in there which talks about, does the system create value for the organisation? You don't do risk analysis and risk reduction just because it's a good thing to do. You do it because it creates value for the organisation. It's got to be an integral part of the organisational process, has to be part of decision making at all levels. It has to explicitly address uncertainty, and we come back to Mark's talk this morning about how do we address the uncertainty. It needs to be based on the best available information, so we need to have other systems that feed that. It needs to be tailored, take human and cultural factors into account, and I'll come to that strongly halfway through. So there's a whole load of factors in there which look at the way in which we view risk. So then I went to the other part of this, and having done a whole load of OH&S training through my career at various times, I thought, well, let's go back to a framework that we all understand, which is the hierarchy of hazard control. And I want to go through this level by level, remembering that the top of this list is always going to be better than something lower down. So elimination will always be better than using protective equipment. And from a business value perspective, you always get better bang for your buck, if you like, from eliminating a risk than from trying to take administrative controls, etc. So this is a standard straight out of National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health view of risk management. I just want to overlay it with something else, which is who has decision-making responsibility in this hierarchy, because that's really important. So who has the control? If we look at elimination, that is largely a discussion that is held by politicians. The biggest issue that we have is that political mandate will change before and after an event. So where you may well have political mandate and decision prior to an event, if it's a big event and something goes wrong, you'll probably find that it's vanished. As we move down there, substitution and engineering controls usually are put into place by management in organisations, commissioners or chief officers or commanders, if you like, and they work their way down. Practitioners tend to be down at the administrative controls training and work scheduling, and the firefighter at the end of the hose is down the bottom of this list, looking at, well, what's the PPE I've been given, what are the orders I've been given, what's the control I've been given. But importantly, the power to completely mess up everything above it lies at the bottom. So if you don't put on all your PPE or you choose not to follow the administrative controls, then all of that can be undone by the person on the fire line. So I want to start by just pulling these apart a bit. So I'm going to start with elimination. And what we mean by elimination is eliminating the risk in the first place, eliminating the process that gets to it. Now, as I go through these, I'm not going to advocate for any particular position, and I'm sure I'll upset some people in the process. But what I'm trying to do is ask a series of questions that I would like you all to ask yourself along the way, to say, well, do we have to do business as usual? Can we think about things in a different way? So I wanted to start by looking at that top level, what are the objectives we're trying to do? So in that ISO standard, we talk about objectives. And in the hierarchy of control, we talk about objectives. I thought one way of looking at this is, let's have a look at some organisational vision statements. These are straight off websites, so these are what is publicly promulgated, if you like. This is what the organisation lives by. In Australia, you've got the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, largely a volunteer fire service. It's probably one of the largest fire services in the world. But you read through that and it talks about community-based fire and emergency services. It talks about protecting the community and the environment. So it's very, very community-centred, very community-focused. You go and look at the US, and I tried to dig around for various, at least national ones. The closest thing you get is this vision that's in the cohesive strategy, where it's all about safely and extinguishing fires and use of fire where allowable, and as at the bottom of there is learning to live with fire. Nothing wrong with that, that's a great organisational statement as well, but it is different to, say, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, which is community-based. Then I went looking at what, if you like, pure fire services. CAL FIRE vision talks about to be the leader in providing fire protection, which is looking at them as an organisation and where they see themselves. And in that vision, you see that it doesn't even mention the community. So that leads you to a whole load of issues and questions that which, if any of these, is the right approach? What is your organisational vision? Where does that sit in this continuum, if you like, about internally viewing yourself as opposed to viewing yourself as part of a community? So if we accept that wildfires are inevitable, which I'm sure this room would never deny, they will always happen. We'll always have some ignition in the landscape, so they are inevitable. They're natural, and in most ecosystems, we've got to have them. So why do we seek to put them out? So that's a question that we should be thinking about. We know implicitly the answer, we put them out because they're impacting on things that we value, but should we be putting them all out? Should we be doing something different with different parts of the fire? Should we be doing things differently in a way that doesn't put other things at risk that we value? So some questions that came to mind when I was thinking about this, and I don't have answers to any of these because each jurisdiction is different. This is very much at the political level. This is driven by the politics of the community and your politicians in your various ages. Why are we fighting fires in the first place? We use terminology that is all about military terminology of fighting fires. Secondly, why is it the government's job to protect private assets? It's come over a long period of time of fire services becoming parts of government. If we remember where the history of fire services in the urban environment came from, they were private fire services run by insurance companies to protect their assets. So why does the government work in that space? Are there better ways of dealing with the risks? Certainly in Australia, there's this concept now of shared responsibility and community resilience. So what is the role of the homeowner? And if the homeowner doesn't do something for themselves, look after their houses, look after their risk in their own way, why should we be putting firefighters at risk to protect assets of people who haven't protected the assets themselves? They're all questions that we probably should be asking at some point. Why do we need to put people in front of fires that are unstoppable? And I think that question has come up a couple of times in the talks I've been in while we've been here. we need to understand those fires that we're going to have very limited ability to do anything with until the weather changes, rather than putting firefighters into the way of some of these things. And is business as usual and incremental improvement taking us in the right direction? And I'll come to a little bit into that, but is firefighting really fundamentally any different today than it was in the 1930s? And I'll come to that in a minute. If we look at substitution, and this is all about doing things in a different way. So if we've ruled out the fact that we're not going to fight fires and that we really have to because politically it's going to be something that's not going to be allowable not to do it, then is there a different way of doing it? So moving on to substitution means that at the moment, as I said, government fights fire largely in most jurisdictions. So why don't we get someone else to do it? There are many examples around the world, and some of them are sponsors of this conference, of privatisation of firefighting. So why don't we just pay somebody else to do it? Outsource the risk, outsource the cost. There are studies from, this came from, which you can't read down the bottom there, came from IBIS World, that basically said that the private sector could probably do better at firefighting and save 10 to 40% of the cost in the process. In that same study, and this is a US-based study, they saw revenues growing at about 12.5% and projected revenues at about 9%. So it's a small business at the moment, but it's growing, and we're seeing more of it. Just some examples when I went trawling through the internet. We've obviously got Working on Fire now, which is working in 5 continents. We've got a large association in the US, which is representing a lot of these things. We've got companies in Europe, and I found this one in Australia, which I'd never heard of, but they do a lot of industrial response services, including wildfire. And there are statements now where we're seeing private fire trucks and fire engines being bought by insurance companies that are being sent into high-risk environments in the US to protect the multi-million-dollar mansions. So we're starting to see some of this happening, but how well is it integrated into our systems? How well will we, as government-based fire services, interact with these ones? And is it something that the community would ever allow? The other part of doing things differently is to look at some of the mitigation rather than respond and recover discussions. This is a very active discussion in Australia. There is a lot of push to mitigate rather than respond and recover. In Australia, for example, annual cost of natural hazards is about $6 billion a year, and we're spending a couple of $100 million, if that, on mitigation. We know that the payback on those are between 3 and 4 times on mitigation to response. It is really important to look at that. So why do we keep pouring more and more money into large aircraft or into fancy new machines when maybe we should be looking at something else? And let me just talk a bit about engineering controls. So engineering controls are the sorts of things where you build fences around things, or you put signs up, or you make statements about what will or won't be done. And these become important, but they're less effective. I'll just put that quote up because I've always liked this quote. And I would ask the question is, are we actually doing things any differently, more different to that? So this was a person who lived in Narberthong in Victoria in the 1939 fires in Victoria, which were huge fires, burnt two-thirds of the state, a third of the state. He basically said, I got on my horse, I had my rake head with me, and I knew that, and a nail, and I knew somebody would find me a stick to nail my rake to. And he went on to say, he'd put a bit of bran and oats and stuff to feed the pony, and off he went on his horse and rake to fight the fires. Now, Narberthong was a town that got burnt in the 2009 fires as well. So it's an area that is somewhat has a history of this. But are we really doing things differently? We are still largely putting out fires in similar ways. We may have bigger things that we use to do it, whether it's DC-10s or 747s or large MOG vehicles that we see driving through bushland. Are we just doing the same thing, just with different tools? So is it just been an incremental improvement in the way we do things? And has that actually served the community? Are we actually saying we are becoming more risk averse with some of those machines because we're taking people away from doing the things on the ground and maybe not protecting the community? Some of the other things we need to do better, I think, is in prescribed burning, fuel reduction and fuel breaks. In Australia and around the world, we know that prescribed burning or hazard reduction burning is a contentious issue. But I've never really understood why it's a contentious issue. Why is putting natural fire back into the landscape such a big issue? Yes, the occasional one will escape. Yes, it will impact on communities from time to time, but surely the risk reduction is worth that. But do we commit enough to reducing this risk? Do we have the political and community support? And that's the difficult one, because it does become political, and it's like many of the other science debates at the moment. The science may well be clear, but like the climate debate and like some of the other debate, there'll always be naysayers who've managed to get their voice heard. And that is always a challenge, because they'll get the community support behind it. So one of the things I think we need to be doing more of is more hazard reduction and more fuel reduction and fuel management. Some of the other ones, and these were just some examples, I went trawling, and automating and unmanned solutions, whether that's UAVs, whether it's on-the-ground tankers, whether it's whatever. These have been around for a while. People have been playing with these sorts of remotely controlled vehicles, but they've always been resisted. Is there a good reason for that? Why aren't we considering them as alternatives to putting people in the way of fires? Is it just because it's not the way we've always done it? Is it just because it's not currently business as usual? Or are there really justifiable reasons why that's the case? Are they really a replacement for what we do on the ground? Or are they just niche products that can be used in places that we don't want to send firefighters into? So just moving down this a bit, administrative controls. This is all about training and work scheduling. This is about how we make decisions on the ground. It's an important part of how the firefighter interacts, I guess, or the practitioner interacts with the will of the management, if you like. We've heard a couple of talks today that talk about the 1018 standard firefighting orders on the 18 watch outs and situations, and LACES or LCES or whatever form it may be, which is really just about trying to summarise 10 things into 4 words or 5 words. Is this really the best that we can do in terms of telling our firefighters what to do on the ground? And how easy are they to bring to the front of their mind in the middle of firefighting? So is it enough? Is 1018 enough? I want to draw on a particular book by Christine Owen and various others who were all part of some work that we did over a period of about 10 years in trying to understand human factors challenges in emergency management. It's an interesting topic area, and Chris Bierman earlier on talked about some of the challenges, some of our current work, but this is drawing on some of the older stuff that's out there. So emergency services response work is not as easily bounded as other safety critical domains. We had a look at some of this to say, can we pick up stuff that, for example, air traffic control does or pilots do, where they train and train and train and train the same or events. Basically, it was found that no, you can't, because wildfires aren't like that, and you can't train in that way. Distinct features of the way that emergency events involve wicked problems, which means there is no solution, that by creating a solution to one thing, you're creating a problem to another. So there isn't anything that fits in there. Unanticipated consequences and highly independent consequential effects are seen in these types of management cases. So yes, you may make a decision that you think is going to do that, but because of the interdependencies, it does something completely different. And that is a core challenge of what we're trying to do. There's a great quote out of that's used throughout the book, but everything is simple in war, but even the simplest thing is difficult. So it's about what we do in wildland firefighting. Threat-induced stress, which we've talked a bit about in some of the talks today, can make the simplest of actions difficult. We're overwhelmed by the amount of information that is coming in, whether that's in the incident control team, in the state coordination centres, or even on the fire land. We are overwhelmed by the amount of information that is coming in. So if you're under stress, which can degrade any or all of the cognitive functions, how can you remember 10 standing orders and 18 watchouts? You can't. We heard just before the break about how smoke impacts on your cognitive ability. So you're trying to do that, not only are you stressed, but you're now cognitively impaired because you're in smoke. You're probably also physically stressed. So how can you remember all of this stuff and get it right all of the time? Therefore, wildfire survival training and the procedures, and we sort of touched on this a bit in some of the talks, need to be simple and practiced frequently under realistic simulated life threat conditions, and that's difficult to do. Some of the urban brigades do that fairly well by locking people into smoke-filled buildings and trying to get them to escape, but life threat conditions are really difficult to do in training. So, some questions that come out of that bit is, do we understand how what we're asking our firefighters to do is interpreted in the heat of battle? Why are a number of the inquiries into injuries and deaths come back to people not wearing their correct PPE, not following what you would have thought was a standard order? Do we factor in human behaviour and frailties into our decision making? So this comes back to that uncertainty. Not only are fires uncertain in terms of their weather, their fire behaviour and behaviours of our firefighters, but they're inbuilt in our firefighters. They have their own behaviours and they have their own frailties on the fire ground. Do we rely too much on standards and orders? Should we just be giving, I think in a term that Ewan's used many times, a commander's intent as opposed to detailed instructions about what needs to be done? Do we effectively teach our firefighters and commanders how to make good decisions? Decision making is something that needs to be taught all the way up and down the command chain so that we know how to make good decisions. There's now so much new equipment, aircraft, technologies, systems of work that are all designed to make us firefighters safer, but do they sometimes distract us from making good decisions around the core and primary purpose of protecting the community? So in Australia, again, I'll use an Australian example. We haven't seen major firefighter loss. We've seen ones and twos from various events since a major event in Linton. But we've seen one fire event kill 173 people in the community. We've seen routinely community members killed. Have we swung too far in terms of trying to protect our firefighters and lost sight of the community we're trying to protect? And how do we re-engage in that discussion? The final part of what I want to talk about relates to the bit of last resort, if you like. It's all about protective equipment and protective things that we give people. If we go back again, this is 1939. Great protective equipment. They've got their caps on. It's a good start. But these, and they've got their branch. But that's what protective equipment was in 1939, and we lost many, many firefighters. In fact, they probably weren't firefighters, they're probably mill operators and forestry workers, etc. But we need to consider some of the residual risks that we can't take out with all the other things. So smoke. Smoke is becoming a huge issue. We heard just before the break about the impact of smoke on respiratory health. We heard about smoke in terms of its impact on communities. Smoke is an integral part of the way in which we can deal with firefighting. Smoke is inevitable. A lot of land managers, when they're doing prescribed burning, can manage to stay out of the smoke, but firefighters who are protecting assets can't stay out of the smoke as much. We have very little monitoring about what smoke impacts are doing to our firefighters and to our communities. We have very little knowledge about the long-term impacts and the cancer impacts of smoke on our firefighters and communities. It is really important that we understand. It's important that we understand the impact of smoke on some other neighbouring industries, if you like. So in Australia and I gather in the US now, there's a large pushback on prescribed burning, mainly because of smoke impact on vine vineyards, on grapes and those things. So that's really important. Presumptive legislation in terms of cancer in firefighters has been extended in Australia now across urban firefighters and in one state to volunteer firefighters. But this could be a big sleeper issue in the longer term as we all grow older and actually become susceptible to some of the cancers that could come. So we need to think about this. No way are we going to put rural firefighters running up and down the side of hills in full breathing apparatus. So what are we going to do about this? So you've got the particulates, you've got the carbon monoxide, you've got a whole load of the noxious volatile organics, all of which we need to understand better. This is becoming more. We've had a number of fatalities in Australia from tree fall. All of those wonderful eucalypts that we've nicely exported to most of Europe and most of the US have this wonderful habit after fire and in drought of falling over. I was fairly careful in trying to find a picture that didn't kill somebody. This tree only injured the firefighters who were in the cabin at the front. But tree fall on firefighters has become a major killer on our firegrounds. We need to understand that, because certainly post-fire events, when you're going in to mop up, we need to be better aware of what we're doing around trees, understand the way in which we can better predict and understand which trees are going to fall, because that's a big tree. Serious problem that we do need to think about. Burnovers. There are a number of approaches to this, and I gather from various discussions that the debate about use of fire shelters in Europe is still raging. Australia doesn't use fire shelters. Australia uses cabin protection systems. We have never used? We might have used them at some point, but we don't use fire shelters. Protection from burnovers is a critical part of what we do. Firefighters will find themselves in situations where they get trapped. But what we don't want to do is to give them enough sense of safety, if you like, that they put themselves in increasingly greater risk by going to places they probably shouldn't have gone to in the first place, believing that their burnover systems will protect them. I did have some YouTube videos, but they didn't work. But so that you'll hear in the closing keynote, I think, about some of the work that the US is doing about improving their fire shelter technology, and I think that's a good move, and it's the way that the US have chosen to go. In Australia, there's been a lot of work around trying to protect the crews by giving them a safe haven within their truck. And this was a recent test trying to simulate the conditions where firefighters died in the Linton event. But you can see that the outside temperatures there were getting to 600 degrees centigrade, whilst the internal cabin was staying below 38, which is a good outcome. And that's about using sprinkler systems, it's about using curtains, it's about better positioning of trucks, etc., and making sure you've got fire-protected brake lines and fuel lines and all the other things that go with it. There's something you always need to do when you're speaking. You make sure that you work out who's going to be chairman, and then you use the quote, because then they're quite nice and easy on you on questions afterwards. So I'll just like to quote from Ewan, who was the special inquirer into a recent fire in Western Australia. And it's all about a failure to plan. And are we planning for the future, or are we planning on what happened in the past? It's always easy to go back and to pull apart a past event and work out what happens. But you quite often then don't see what could have gone, what might have been, what the future might look like. So an over-reliance on what happened in the past causes you to be backwards looking and not forwards looking. And in learning lessons of the past, it's necessary, but you should be driven by imagination and foresight. It was also a commentary that came out of the Fukushima tidal wave issue, tsunami issue, about a failure of imagination, because it's hard to do that. Because if you say, well, we've got this nuclear power station, it's sitting on the coast in an earthquake-prone area, we know we get tsunamis. Let's imagine the biggest earthquake ever with a biggest tsunami we've ever seen, and impacting on the nuclear power station, and we'll run that as our emergency management exercise. You get laughed out of the building, but that's exactly what happened. So it's important that when we're looking at our emergency training and our emergency management and our thought process, that we think beyond what has already happened, because the biggest event has yet to happen. And the biggest event, it will happen, because we talk in terms of 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 20, 200,000 or whatever years. As long as that number has a 1 in front, means it's inevitable. It may happen tomorrow, but the odds are pretty low, but it could happen tomorrow, it could happen the day after. It's something you've got to focus on, is what is the worst case scenario. And Ewan went on to say that the greatest failure may well be the failure to imagine. So I'll challenge you all to think about the way in which you do things, because that failure to imagine may well be the downfall of the next big event that comes. So just in some closing questions. When did you last consider the hierarchy of controls that are in your organisations? Is it something that you do regularly? Is it something you've never done? Why don't you do it? Is it just too hard? Is it too hard to challenge the political level or challenge the senior management level? Do you stop and consider why you're doing something and with the way in which you're doing it? Do you keep doing business as usual because it's easy, or are you prepared to challenge the hierarchy in the name of safety? And do you resort to lower level solutions rather than seeking ones further up that hierarchy of control, just because they may be easier to achieve? It might be easier to get new protective equipment for your firefighter than to challenge the way in which we fight fires, for example. I'll leave you with that. 7 most dangerous words in business are anywhere we've always done it that way. And don't cling on to a mistake just because you spend a lot of time making it. And if you want to know more about us, just go to our website. We have regular newsletters and notes, and we're on Twitter. Hopefully I've offended everybody now. Who didn't I offend?
Thank you. Just stay here, we'll try to. Thank you, Richard, for a very thought-provoking discussion on risk and into the future and the unknown. I'm sure there are some questions out there. Could you please raise your hand if you have a question for Richard? Yes, now we'll see if we can get a microphone to the gentleman there. Yep.
Hello. I was interested in your definition of the top level being the political level, because it seemed to exclude the landowner, your definition of that political discussion, because land use is usually decided by the landowner, less so by government.
It depends on where you define politics, I guess. Yes, land use, but your land use planning is intensely political. So yes, land ownership, and it depends on the jurisdiction, of course. In the Australian context, land use planning is intensely political and will lead to lobbying of members of parliament to get acts and planning restrictions and courts of appeal to overturn planning decisions. So land ownership and the role of the landowner can be political, or it can be other factors, or it could be, it depends on the way in which the jurisdiction works. The power of the landowner is different in different jurisdictions. But I mean, I think because of the way in which a landowner will say, I want to build in this location, which we know is at high risk, and if it gets knocked back by planning authorities, will become political. So I think in the end of the day, politics will say you can do it because they need to get elected. And politics relates to not just the high-level prime ministerial ministers, those types of people, but down at local government levels as well, where those people have to be elected. So when I use the term politics, I mean elected. Does that answer the question? We can talk about it afterwards.
Another question for Richard? No more questions? Could you once again thank very much Richard for his presentation? Thank you.